You are 3 years old when your father dies, and the vultures begin to circle. In the golden halls of the Kremlin, grown men whisper about your future like merchants discussing the price of grain. The morning light filters through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the stone floor where you sit playing with wooden horses. Your nurse, Maria, keeps glancing toward the door. Her hands shake as she arranges your toys, and you notice how she flinches each time footsteps echo in the corridor outside. Something has shifted in the palace overnight, like the moment before a thunderstorm when even the air feels dangerous. "Where is Papa?" you ask, but Maria only pulls you closer, her rough fingers smoothing your hair with desperate gentleness. The answer comes with the arrival of Prince Ivan Shusky, a tall man whose beard carries the scent of wine and whose eyes never seem to focus on what they're looking at. He enters your chambers without permission, his heavy boots marking territory that was never his to claim. Behind him trail other men in rich robes, faces you recognize from formal dinners, but now they wear expressions you've never seen before. "The boy must understand his new circumstances," Shusky announces, though he speaks to the other men rather than to you. His voice carries the authority of someone who has already decided your fate. Vasily III is dead. Russia requires strong guidance. You don't understand all the words, but you comprehend the tone. It's the same voice the stable master uses when discussing which horses to sell at market, practical, detached, evaluating value. Maria's arms tighten around you, and you feel her tears fall onto your head. The days that followed teach you lessons no child should learn. Your mother, Elena Glinskaya, becomes a different person. Her laughter disappears, replaced by the careful politeness of someone walking on broken glass. She still holds you, still tells you stories, but her attention constantly drifts to the shadows. You begin to understand that love alone cannot protect anyone, not even mothers, not even queens. The palace fills with new faces, men who smile too widely, women who speak in whispers, servants who avoid eye contact. Your father's advisors vanish one by one, replaced by Prince Shusky's allies. Each disappearance is explained with words like retirement and family obligations, but you notice how quickly their chambers are reassigned, their belongings removed, their names avoided in conversation. Your lessons continue, but the tutors seem nervous. Father Maximos, who taught you letters, stammers now when reading scripture. His hands shake as he turns pages, and sometimes he stops mid-sentence, staring at the door as if expecting interruption. During one lesson about King David, he begins to explain how the righteous sometimes suffer under the wicked, then catches himself and changes the subject to geography. The change in your daily routine feels subtle at first. Meals arrive later. Your favorite foods disappear from the menu. Guards you've known since birth are replaced by men who watch you with calculation rather than affection. When you ask Maria about these changes, she puts a finger to her lips and glances around the room before whispering, "Little princes must learn to be very, very quiet." Your mother tries to maintain normalcy, but you see how her hands tremble when serving your evening tea. She tells you stories about brave knights and wise kings, but her voice lacks conviction, as if she no longer believes such people exist. Sometimes she stops speaking entirely, staring at the fire with an expression that makes you want to hide. The first real lesson comes during a feast, celebrating some forgotten saint's day. You sit beside your mother at the high table, watching Prince Shusky hold court among the boyars. He speaks of Russia's future with the confidence of ownership, making decisions about trade agreements and military appointments as if your presence means nothing at all. When you try to speak, suggesting a different approach to a territorial dispute you've overheard the adults discussing, Shusky's laughter cuts through the hall like a blade. Children should focus on children's matters, he says, his voice carrying just enough warmth to seem kind to observers. But his eyes remain cold. Leave governing to those who understand its complexities. The hall falls silent. Every face turns toward you, measuring your reaction, cataloging your response for future reference. Your mother's hand finds yours under the table, squeezing with desperate pressure. You understand in that moment that your words carry no weight, your opinions matter to no one, and your royal blood means nothing without the power to enforce respect. That night, lying in your bed while shadows dance on the walls, you hear voices through the stones, muffled conversations about regency councils and administrative restructuring. The words wash over you like water, but the tone communicates everything you need to know. You are not a future ruler being prepared for responsibility. You are an obstacle being managed until you can be removed. Sleep brings dreams of your father's voice calling your name, but you wake to silence and the growing understanding that childhood has ended, though you're still too small to reach the window latches or open heavy doors without help. The men who control your world have forgotten that children possess their own forms of intelligence, the ability to watch, to listen, to remember everything they see. You are 8 years old when your mother stops speaking, and the silence teaches you more about power than any tutor ever could. Elena Glinskaya sits in her chamber, staring at untouched plates of food while her skin grows pale as winter ice. The poison works slowly. Not the dramatic collapse of stories, but a gradual theft of strength, appetite, hope. You watch from the doorway as physicians whisper their useless remedies, their faces betraying what their words refuse to acknowledge. They know what this is. Everyone knows. But knowing and speaking are different forms of courage, and courage has become a luxury none dare afford. "Mama," you whisper, kneeling beside her chair. Her eyes focus on you with effort, as if seeing through deep water. When she tries to smile, the expression sits wrong on her face, like a mask that no longer fits properly. "Remember," she breathes, so quietly you must lean closer to hear. "Remember who you are." 3 days later, she dies. The official announcement speaks of sudden illness, but you've learned to read the spaces between words. In those spaces lives the truth that will shape everything that follows. Prince Shusky's transformation from regent to ruler happens with seamless efficiency. Within hours of your mother's death, he occupies your father's study, wearing your father's ceremonial robes, issuing orders with your father's seal. The transition feels almost natural, as if this moment was always inevitable. The boy requires firm guidance. He announces to the assembled boyars, gesturing toward you as if you were livestock being appraised. Grief makes children unpredictable. Structure will provide stability. The structure he provides feels like slow strangulation. Your daily schedule becomes a series of restrictions disguised as education, lessons in Latin, but only certain texts, training in swordplay, but with blunted weapons, discussions of statecraft that always conclude with reminders of your youth and inexperience. Your chambers shrink. First, the outer room becomes off-limits. Then, the balcony. Eventually, you're confined to a single space, barely larger than a prison cell, though the walls remain decorated with rich tapestries and the windows stay unbarred. The cage feels more civilized than confinement, but the effect remains identical. The worst part isn't the physical limitation, it's watching your own nobles compete for Shusky's favor by demonstrating their indifference to your comfort. Men who once bowed deeply now barely nod. Servants who once hurried to fulfill your requests now take their time, as if serving you has become an optional courtesy rather than an obligation. During court sessions, you're required to sit silently in a chair positioned slightly behind and to the left of the throne, close enough to observe. far enough to emphasize your irrelevance. Shusuke makes decisions about your inheritance while you watch, treating your presence as a formality rather than a requirement. The young prince will understand, in time, that effective governance requires experience. He explains to a delegation of foreign merchants who've come to negotiate trade agreements. Until that wisdom develops, Russia benefits from steady hands guiding policy. The merchants nod politely, but you notice how their eyes move between Shusuke and you, calculating future possibilities. They understand what everyone understands but no one discusses. This arrangement cannot continue indefinitely. Either you will grow strong enough to reclaim power, or you will disappear entirely. Your education in survival begins during these court sessions. You learn to sit perfectly still while listening to discussions of your own murder disguised as administrative planning. You discover that different boyars favor different solutions to the succession question, some preferring marriage alliances that would subordinate you to foreign interests, others suggesting religious orders that would remove you from politics entirely. The conversations happen around you rather than to you, as if you were a piece of furniture that happened to possess ears. This overlooking becomes your advantage. While they plot your future, you study their methods, cataloging weaknesses, dependencies, fears. Prince Fedor Shusuke drinks heavily after receiving bad news and makes careless statements when intoxicated. Prince Andrei relies too heavily on his nephew's counsel and panics when forced to make decisions alone. The Belsky family maintains secret correspondence with Lithuanian contacts, storing the letters in a carved wooden box hidden behind a loose stone in their chambers. Each observation becomes part of a growing collection of potential weapons. You may lack physical strength, legal authority, or political alliances, but you possess something none of them expect: perfect memory sharpened by absolute necessity. Every slight, every weakness, every whispered conspiracy gets filed away in your mind like documents in a treasury. The turning point arrives during your 13th year, when the boyars decide you're old enough for a ceremonial coronation. Not a transfer of real power, Shusuke makes that clear from the beginning, but a formal acknowledgement of your bloodline that will legitimize their continued control. The people require symbols. He explains to his inner circle, unaware that you're listening from an adjacent chamber. A crowned child poses no threat, but it satisfies tradition and prevents foreign interference. The ceremony itself becomes a masterclass in political theater. You stand in the cathedral of the Dormition, surrounded by the same men who destroyed your family. While they place your father's crown on your head and swear oaths of loyalty they have no intention of honoring. But something unexpected happens during those sacred moments. As the weight of the crown settles on your brow, as the ancient words of coronation echo through the cathedral, as hundreds of faces watch your every expression, you realize that symbols carry their own power. You may be a puppet, but you're a puppet wearing the crown of all Russia. That night, alone in your chambers, you make a decision that will reshape the history of your realm. You will not simply endure their control until you're old enough to challenge it. You will study their methods, perfect their techniques, and turn their own weapons against them with an efficiency that will make their casual cruelties seem like children's games. The boy who entered the cathedral that morning dies during the ceremony. The person who emerges understands that mercy is a luxury for those who can afford to show weakness, and that the only escape from a cage is to become more dangerous than the people who built it. You are 16 when you taste blood for the first time, and the sweetness surprises you. Prince Andrei Shusuke kneels in the palace courtyard, his expensive robes soaked with mud and something darker, while the crowd watches in absolute silence. The morning had begun like any other Shusuke denying your request to marry Anastasia Romanovna with his usual condescending explanations about political alliances and foreign treaties. But today, something shifted. The coronation crown sits heavier on your head now. 3 years of wearing it, having taught you what symbols truly mean when backed by will. Marriage requires wisdom beyond your years. Shusky lectures, his tone suggesting he believes himself clever. These matters demand careful consideration of international consequences. You listen to his familiar refrain while studying the faces of the guards positioned around the chamber. Their loyalty was purchased months ago, with promises and threats delivered in equal measure. Today marks the collection of that debt. Perhaps, you respond, your voice carrying a new quality that makes several courtiers glance nervously toward the exits. But I find myself wondering about consequences you might not have considered. The arrest happens swiftly. Guards move with practiced efficiency, seizing Shuisky's arms while he splutters protests about protocol and proper procedures. His confidence crumbles as he realizes that the boy he dismissed has become something else entirely, something capable of decisive action. "This is impossible," he gasps, struggling against restraints he cannot escape. "I am your appointed guardian. I speak for the Boyar Council." You spoke, you correct, savoring the past tense. Now others will speak for you. The execution takes place in the main courtyard, where maximum witnesses can observe. You position yourself on the palace steps, ensuring every noble present understands the new landscape. Shusky's death, whether by guards' clubs or hunting dogs, depends on which chronicle you believe serves a purpose beyond mere revenge. It announces the end of one era and the violent birth of another. Anastasia Romanovna becomes your wife within the month, but she represents more than personal happiness. She becomes your anchor to whatever humanity remains beneath the crown's weight. When her hands touch your face, when she laughs at your private jokes, when she treats you as Ivan rather than as the terrible instrument you're becoming, you remember that connection is possible even for someone learning to rule through fear. But marriage alone cannot solve the fundamental problem of your inheritance. A realm where local nobles exercise near absolute power over territories they treat as personal kingdoms. They collect taxes for their own benefit, maintain private armies, and regard royal authority as a distant suggestion rather than binding command. You begin assembling what advisors will later call the chosen councilmen, selected for competence rather than bloodline, loyalty rather than inheritance. These advisors help modernize Russia's military and legal systems, but their most valuable service involves providing detailed intelligence about aristocratic corruption throughout your domains. The information becomes more precious than gold. You learn which boyars steal tax revenues, which maintain treasonous correspondence with foreign powers, which plot your assassination over dinner wine. Knowledge transforms into leverage, and leverage becomes the foundation of a new form of governance. Your first serious interrogation involves Prince Dmitry Belsky, suspected of corresponding with Polish agents. The session takes place in a chamber beneath the palace, where stone walls muffle sounds and shadows hide expressions. You discover that fear operates like a musical instrument. Properly applied pressure produces specific notes of desperation, confession, pleading. "I have done nothing wrong," Belsky insists, but his voice carries the tremor of a man who knows his words ring false. "Perhaps," you muse, circling his chair like a hunter evaluating prey. But doing nothing wrong and appearing innocent are different accomplishments. The letters found in your chambers suggest interesting conversations with foreign courts. The confession comes in stages: first denial, then partial admission, finally complete breakdown. You learn that different personalities respond to different pressures. Proud men crack under public humiliation. Greedy men break when threatened with financial ruin. Family men surrender when their children enter the conversation. Each successful interrogation teaches new lessons about human nature's weaknesses. Each broken boyar becomes an example that spreads through aristocratic circles like plague, creating an atmosphere where guilt and innocence matter less than the appearance of absolute loyalty. The reputation of these sessions grows beyond their reality. Nobles begin confessing to crimes before being accused, desperately hoping voluntary submission might earn mercy they suspect will never come. The fear becomes self-sustaining, requiring less actual violence to maintain order. But fear alone cannot build an empire. You need institutional reform, military modernization, administrative efficiency. The boyars who controlled your childhood proved that traditional power structures serve their own interests rather than Russia's strength. Change requires new systems designed to concentrate authority where it belongs in your hands. The idea begins forming during sleepless nights when you walk the palace corridors, considering how to reshape a realm built on compromise and weakness into something capable of surviving in a world where strength alone determines survival. You are 28 when your closest friend betrays you, and the wound cuts deeper than any blade ever could. Prince Andrei Kurbsky's letter arrives on a rain-soaked morning, the ink running slightly where water has touched the parchment, as if the heavens themselves weep for what friendship has become. The words burn themselves into your memory as you read them in the privacy of your study, with only the crackling fire as witness to your growing rage. Kurbsky writes with the eloquence of a man who believes his treachery carries divine sanction, explaining that he can no longer serve a ruler who has abandoned Christian principles and transformed into a beast worse than any barbarian king. The irony tastes bitter in your mouth. This from the man who shared your childhood fears, who witnessed your humiliation under the boyars, who understood better than anyone why you became what necessity demanded. Yet even he has chosen to flee to Lithuania, taking with him detailed knowledge of Russian military strategies, fortification plans, and most dangerously, your personal vulnerabilities. You set the letter aside and stare into the fire, feeling something fundamental crack in your chest. If Kurbsky, who knew you before the crown, who fought beside you in battle, who called you brother in private moments, if even he could abandon you, then trust itself becomes impossible. The realization arrives with crushing weight. You are completely alone, surrounded by potential enemies, whose loyalty extends only until better offers arrive. Anastasia finds you there hours later, still holding the letter, still staring at flames that have long since died to embers. Her presence usually brings comfort, but tonight, even her gentle touch cannot reach through the ice forming around your heart. "What troubles you?" she asks, though her voice carries the careful tone of someone who already suspects the answer will bring pain. "Friendship," you reply, the word tasting like ash. "I have learned what it costs." Your response to Kurbsky's betrayal introduces innovations in psychological warfare that will echo through history. Rather than simply declaring him an enemy, you begin a correspondence campaign designed to articulate your political philosophy and justify methods that even your allies question. The letters you compose become masterworks of intellectual brutality, arguing that rulers who show mercy to traitors invite greater betrayals, that kingdoms survive only when subjects fear their sovereign more than foreign enemies. Each carefully crafted sentence serves as both personal attack and political manifesto, designed to destroy Kurbsky's reputation while establishing principles that will govern your reign. But correspondence alone cannot address the fundamental problem. Kurbsky's defection represents the existence of nobles who believe their personal honor supersedes royal authority. His betrayal reveals how traditional loyalties crumble under pressure, how even your closest advisors might choose self-interest over service. The solution arrives like religious revelation. You will create an entirely new system of governance, one that operates outside traditional legal constraints and serves your will directly. In 1565, you announced the division of Russia into two administrative zones, Oprichnina and Zemshchina, unleashing black-clad riders bearing the symbols of dog's head and broom to sniff out and sweep away treason wherever it hides. The oprichniki become more than mere guards or administrators. They evolve into instruments of systematic terror, operating as secret police, military unit, and traveling theater company specializing in political horror. Their black clothing and symbolic accessories serve psychological purposes as much as practical ones, creating an image that haunts the dreams of potential rebels. Your instructions to them remain deliberately vague, encouraging creative interpretation rather than demanding specific actions. This approach serves multiple purposes. It allows plausible deniability when their methods prove too extreme for foreign observers, prevents enemies from predicting procedures, and most importantly, ensures the fear they generate exceeds rational assessment of actual threats. The Oprichnina's effectiveness reveals itself most dramatically during the Novgorod campaign, when intelligence reports suggest the Merchant Republic has been negotiating with Polish representatives. Rather than simple military conquest, you design the assault as a demonstration in applied terror that will eliminate future thoughts of independence throughout your realm. The campaign begins with psychological preparation rather than physical attack. Months of carefully planted rumors establish Novgorod's alleged treachery in public consciousness, ensuring your eventual arrival will be interpreted as justified punishment rather than arbitrary aggression. Evidence of conspiracy appears in multiple locations, building a legal case that satisfies both domestic and international observers. When you finally march on Novgorod in January 1570, the city's gates open without resistance. Citizens who have heard reports of your methods understand that opposition will only increase punishment's severity. Their submission, however, earns no mercy. Instead, it provides a captive audience for weeks of executions designed to demonstrate what happens when subjects forget their proper relationship to royal authority. The techniques employed in Novgorod push beyond simple execution into realms of creative suffering that leave witnesses traumatized for life. You personally supervise many punishments, offering commentary on technique and suggesting improvements to your executioner's methods. Foreign merchants trapped in the city by winter weather provide detailed accounts that spread throughout Europe's trading networks. But something unexpected happens during those frozen weeks of terror. As you watch your oprichniki carry out increasingly elaborate punishments, you notice a change in their expressions. The initial enthusiasm for their work gradually transforms into something else, a mechanical efficiency that suggests they have begun viewing systematic cruelty as routine rather than necessary. More troubling still, you catch glimpses of calculation in their eyes when they look at you. Not the fear or loyalty you expect, but the measuring gaze of men wondering when their master's attention might turn toward them. The instrument of terror you created to secure your power has developed its own agenda, its own survival instincts. Late at night, alone in your chambers while reports of the day's executions pile on your desk, you begin to suspect that you have unleashed something beyond your complete control. The oprichnina serves your purposes for now, but institutions have their own momentum, their own logic of self-preservation. You dismiss these concerns as temporary weakness brought on by exhaustion and the weight of necessary decisions. After all, the system works. Domestic opposition has been eliminated, foreign invasions deterred, royal authority restored. But in quiet moments, when sleep eludes you and shadows seem to move independently on the walls, you wonder whether you have become the master of your creation or its most important prisoner. The question haunts you as reports arrive from throughout your realm describing the oprichnina's expanding activities. Villages where neighbors refuse to speak to each other for fear of being reported as seditious. Merchant guilds dissolving as members worry that business partnerships might be interpreted as political conspiracies. Religious institutions fragmenting as priests avoid sermons that could be construed as criticism. The fear that once protected you from external threats now isolates you from potential allies, creating distances that make normal governance nearly impossible. The very success of your methods has begun undermining the foundations they were designed to protect, transforming Russia into a realm where survival depends entirely on avoiding attention rather than contributing to collective strength. Standing at your window overlooking the Moscow River, watching ice form along the banks as winter settles over your capital, you recognize that you have reached a crossroads. The path that led from humiliated child to absolute ruler has brought you to a place where further progress requires abandoning the last constraints on your power or accepting that some prices are too high to pay, even for absolute security. The choice, you realize, will determine not only your legacy, but the soul of the realm you have fought so hard to control. You are 30 when the woman who saved your humanity dies in your arms, her final breath escaping like smoke from a dying fire. Anastasia's body feels impossibly light as you hold her in the dim chamber where candles have burned through 3 sleepless nights, their flames casting dancing shadows that seem to mock your grief. The poison that killed her worked with sophisticated precision. Not the crude arsenic favored by common murderers, but something refined, expensive, obtainable only by people with access to foreign courts and unlimited resources. You recognize the signs weeks before the physicians admitted defeat: the gradual weakness, the loss of appetite, the way her skin took on the translucent quality of melting ice. "Promise me," she whispers during one of her final lucid moments, her fingers gripping yours with surprising strength. "Promise you will not let this darkness consume you entirely." But even as you nod, even as you make the vow her love demands, you feel something fundamental breaking inside your chest. The last restraint on your nature snaps like an overstretched rope, and in its place grows a cold certainty that mercy is the luxury of those who have never truly suffered loss. Within days of her funeral, your investigation reveals the conspiracy you suspected but hoped did not exist. The Adashev family trusted advisors, men who had helped you modernize Russia's institutions, had been corresponding with Lithuanian agents for months. Their letters, discovered hidden in a false bottom of an ornate chest, contained detailed information about your personal habits, psychological vulnerabilities, and most damningly, your complete emotional dependence on your wife. The betrayal cuts deeper than Kurbsky's defection because it reveals something more sinister than political disagreement. These men had studied your humanity like natural philosophers, examining a specimen, cataloging your weaknesses, and selling that intelligence to enemies who understood exactly how to weaponize love itself. Your response abandons any pretense of traditional justice. Rather than public trials or formal accusations, you arrange for Alexei Adashev himself to be quietly exiled to Dorpat, where he dies of what physicians diplomatically describe as sudden illness. But his associates face more elaborate consequences designed to demonstrate what happens when subjects mistake your affection for weakness. The systematic destruction of the conspiracy unfolds over months, each punishment carefully calibrated to send specific messages. Estates burn while their owners watch from cages specially constructed for the purpose. Families are separated and scattered to distant monasteries, where they will spend their remaining years contemplating the cost of treachery. Most importantly, allies are forced to participate in the punishments, demonstrating their loyalty through active complicity rather than passive submission. The process teaches you that grief, properly channeled, becomes a weapon more powerful than any army. Your anguish over Anastasia's murder transforms into a systematic paranoia that views every relationship as a potential security threat. If the men closest to your inner circle could betray you so thoroughly, then trust itself becomes impossible. Your second marriage to Maria Temryukovna represents a calculated attempt to replace emotional vulnerability with strategic alliance. The Circassian princess brings connections to Caucasus military traditions, and her factional influence coincides with increasingly harsh methods appearing throughout your administration. But this union, built on mutual utility rather than affection, creates its own problems, as both partners monitor each other for signs of betrayal while maintaining the fiction of marital cooperation. Maria herself proves adept at court intrigue, using her position to advance Circassian interests and eliminate rivals through carefully orchestrated accusations of disloyalty. You begin to suspect that even this relationship, deliberately constructed to avoid emotional entanglement, might become another weapon turned against you by enemies clever enough to exploit your need for political alliance. The Oprichnina system, meanwhile, develops its own internal logic that increasingly operates beyond your direct control. The black-clad riders discover that accusations of treason against wealthy families result in property confiscations they can claim as rewards for their service. This creates perverse incentives where your agents actively seek evidence of conspiracy because successful investigations improve their own economic circumstances. The system becomes self-perpetuating, as families targeted by the oprichniki sometimes do turn treasonous out of desperation, confirming original suspicions and justifying further expansion of the security apparatus. Your creation begins consuming Russian society from within, destroying the trust networks that hold communities together, and replacing them with surveillance relationships that serve no one's interests except the terror apparatus itself. Reports arrive daily describing the social dissolution spreading throughout your realm. Villages where neighbors refuse to speak to each other for fear their words will be reported as seditious. Merchant guilds dissolving as members worry that business partnerships might be interpreted as political conspiracies. Religious institutions fragmenting as priests avoid sermons that could be construed as criticism of royal policies. The economic consequences compound the social destruction. Trade networks collapse when merchants cannot trust their partners. Agricultural production declines as peasants flee from regions under oprichnina control. Tax revenues drop as local administrators focus more attention on identifying security threats than collecting government income. The system designed to strengthen your power begins undermining the foundations of that power itself. But the most disturbing development occurs within your own family, as the methods you've perfected for controlling external threats begin affecting your relationship with your eldest son. Ivan Ivanovich grows into a young man who questions not just your policies, but the philosophical foundations underlying them, suggesting that the terror apparatus you built to protect Russia is actually destroying it from within. His criticism, delivered during a heated argument about military strategy in 1581, carries the weight of generational rebellion, the implicit suggestion that your life's work has been a tragic mistake, that the suffering you've orchestrated has served no purpose beyond satisfying your own psychological needs. The words strike at vulnerabilities you thought had been armored over by years of systematic cruelty. The blow you deliver in response intended as paternal correction rather than violence carries the accumulated force of decades spent in perpetual rage. The sound of metal meeting bone echoes through the chamber like a bell tolling, and in the silence that follows, you watch your son's eyes lose focus as blood pools beneath his head. The immediate aftermath reveals how completely your court has adapted to operating within an atmosphere of perpetual crisis. Courtiers do not gasp in horror or rush to aid your dying heir. Instead, they carefully arrange their expressions into masks of appropriate concern, while mentally calculating how this development will affect their own positions. Even in this moment of ultimate family tragedy, they think politically rather than humanly. Your son's death eliminates the primary succession plan that justified many of your more extreme policies. The argument had always been that temporary suffering was necessary to create a strong state that Ivan Ivanovich would inherit and moderate. With that future erased by your own hand, The entire philosophical structure supporting your reign collapses into meaningless brutality that serves no purpose beyond its own perpetuation. Standing over your son's body, watching servants carefully clean blood from marble floors while maintaining expressions of professional detachment, you understand that you have finally succeeded in destroying the last thing you genuinely loved. Anastasia was taken by enemies, but Ivan Ivanovich, you killed yourself in a moment when rage overwhelmed the last fragments of paternal instinct. The recognition arrives with devastating clarity. You have become the very monster your childhood tormentors were, someone who destroys what he claims to protect. The trap you built to contain your enemies has become the cage that contains you, and escape is no longer possible because the role has consumed the actor so completely that no other identity remains accessible. You are 53 when death begins its final approach, and for the first time in decades, you feel something approaching relief. The body that once seemed capable of endless violence now betrays you with embarrassing frequency joints, seizing during crucial meetings, vision blurring while reading reports, hands trembling so violently that signing documents becomes a daily struggle against your own mortality. The irony tastes bitter as winter wine. After spending a lifetime perfecting methods to extend others' suffering, your own death appears determined to proceed with merciful efficiency. Physicians whisper about kidney failure and liver damage, using medical terms to describe what everyone understands: the accumulated cost of ruling through perpetual fury, of sleeping every night, surrounded by enemies real and imagined. Your final months become an accounting of what your reign has actually accomplished versus what you intended to achieve. Russia stretches from the Baltic to the Caspian Sea, larger than any realm your father could have imagined. But the empire feels fragile in ways that territorial maps cannot capture. The administrative structures you built to project power have become parasitic systems that consume resources without generating corresponding benefits. The Oprichnina was officially abolished in 1572 after failing to defend Moscow from Crimean raiders, but its methods and precedents have evolved into institutional practices that outlive the organization itself. Former oprichniki and their descendants continue viewing systematic investigation and punishment as necessary tools of governance, passing these techniques to the next generation like family traits. You attempt to compose letters to foreign rulers, explaining your methods, justifying decades of policy choices that have isolated Russia from most of European civilization. But the words resist organization. Arguments collapse under their own contradictions, and you increasingly suspect that no external audience exists capable of understanding the logic that seemed so clear during its implementation. The isolation has become complete, not just political, but intellectual and moral. You rule a realm where your slightest displeasure can trigger executions, yet you cannot find a single person willing to provide honest counsel about problems that grow more serious with each passing month. The fear that once protected you from external threats now keeps potential allies at distances that make effective governance nearly impossible. Your relationship with Fyodor, your surviving son, becomes the final test of whether anything human remains beneath the crown's weight. He approaches you with the careful deference of someone navigating around a sleeping predator, speaking softly and avoiding sudden movements that might trigger unpredictable violence. The fact that your own child fears you more than he loves you serves as perhaps the most accurate measure of what you have become. Yet in Fyodor's presence, you sometimes glimpse fragments of the father you might have been under different circumstances. When he asks about his childhood, about his mother, about the early years before the Oprichnina transformed daily life into security theater, your responses carry emotional weight that surprises both of you. These conversations reveal that the capacity for ordinary human affection still exists somewhere beneath the accumulated scar tissue of systematic brutality. The foreign diplomats who visit during your final months provide external perspective on your reign's ultimate impact. They describe a Russia that commands international respect through fear rather than admiration, a nation whose military victories are overshadowed by its reputation for internal barbarism. Your methods achieved their immediate objectives. Domestic opposition was eliminated. Foreign invasions were deterred. But the cost was transforming Russia into a civilization that other nations regard with fascinated horror rather than genuine respect. You begin drafting what amounts to a confession disguised as a political testament, attempting to explain how a boy who once wept over injured animals became a man capable of orchestrating industrial-scale suffering. The document grows into a psychological archaeology of your own transformation, tracing decision points where alternatives were rejected and cruelty was chosen as the most efficient solution to immediate problems. The writing process forces you to confront the possibility that many of those decisions were not actually necessary, that alternative approaches might have achieved similar results with less human cost. This recognition arrives too late for practical application, but early enough to poison your final days with retrospective guilt that adds psychological suffering to physical decline. Your death, when it finally comes in March 1584, occurs with remarkable anticlimax for someone whose life was defined by theatrical violence. You collapse during a chess game, pieces scattering across the board in what observers will later interpret as symbolic of the chaos your reign unleashed. The transition from life to death happens with none of the prolonged agony you inflicted on countless others, a mercy you had seized extending to anyone, including yourself. The immediate aftermath reveals how completely your personal authority had become the only thing holding your system together. Without your presence to provide direction and terror, the various factions you created to serve your will begin competing with each other using the same methods they once reserved for state enemies. Fyodor's reign becomes an extended exercise in undoing aspects of your legacy, while lacking the strength necessary to construct alternative institutions. Russia maintains surface stability during his rule, but the underlying problems you created through decades of systematic terror continue festering beneath forced tranquility. Only after Fyodor's death in 1598 does Russia plunge into the time of troubles, a period of civil war and foreign intervention that validates your darkest predictions about what happens when central authority weakens. The chaos that follows suggests that your methods, however brutal, may have been preventing even greater suffering, though the cost of that prevention was measured in countless lives destroyed by systematic terror. But history's final judgment remains ambiguous. You transformed a medieval principality into an empire that would dominate Eurasia for centuries, establishing precedents for centralized authority that future rulers would adapt to their own purposes. Yet you also created institutional models for state-sponsored terror that would inspire some of humanity's worst monsters in later eras. Your legacy raises questions about power, necessity, and moral compromise that each generation must answer for itself, questions that remain as relevant in modern corridors of power as they were in the stone chambers of the Kremlin. The fundamental dynamics of fear, control, and resistance continue shaping political systems across the globe, suggesting that the lessons of your reign extend far beyond the borders of 16th century Russia. In the end, you achieved something unprecedented in human history. You became so effective at inspiring fear that you frightened yourself, so successful at eliminating enemies that you destroyed everything you claimed to protect. The crown that once symbolized divine authority became a cage that trapped its wearer, and the methods designed to ensure survival ultimately guaranteed isolation. The boy who wept over injured animals and the man who orchestrated industrial-scale suffering were the same person, separated only by circumstances, choices, and the gradual erosion of moral constraints under the pressure of absolute power. Your story serves as a warning about the fragility of the barriers that separate civilization from barbarism, and the ease with which fear can transform protectors into the very monsters they claim to guard against. Standing over your chess game in those final moments, perhaps you understood that the real victory had never been about controlling others, but about controlling yourself, a battle you lost so completely that winning became indistinguishable from defeat. The pieces scattered across the board like the fragments of a realm you built through terror, beautiful in their complexity, but ultimately unplayable, a game where the only winning move was never to begin.